Get ready for a week-long celebration of music, community, and fabulous fun with Joy Radiothon 1st to 7th of June, 2024. If you love Rainbow Podcasts, donate to support Joy's massive library of Rainbow content, which is the biggest in the world. And remember, we all flourish with joy. Go to joy.org.au/radiothon.
This is Well on Joy 94.9, presented to you each and every week by Thorn Harbor Health. I'm your host, Cal Hawk, and here on Well, we delve into the issues intersecting and interwoven into the health and well-being of our gender, sex, and sexually diverse communities. This week, we're looking at our well-being online. Joining me this week on Well is Julie Inman-Grant. Julie is Australia's eSafety Commissioner, a role she has held since 2017. Based in Sydney, Australia, Julie heads the world's first internet safety regulator that is responsible for ensuring all Australians have safer and more positive experiences online. Core of Julie's job is to help Australians who have been target of online abuse and to provide education, resources, and training to help people avoid harmful online experiences. In 2020, her team released a statement highlighting the online experiences of people in diverse communities entitled Protecting Voices at Risk Online. Last week, Julie reflected on the 12 months since that statement, and she went on to discuss what is being done to help improve people's online lives since. Julie's here with us today to talk about this work and especially eSafety's plans to support our LGBTIQ communities. Julie, welcome to Well.
Well, I'm happy to be here.
Now, first of all, just before the show, I was talking to you and, a lot of listeners know I grew up in the US and lo and behold, you are from the same kind of pocket of the universe.
I am. I do have family in Pittsburgh. I actually grew up in Seattle, Washington. I've been in Australia and for 20 years, and I still sound like this. So there you go.
Hey, that's people ask me the same thing all the time, and it's what I was encoded with at the beginning, and so I haven't quite shook the American accent yet.
That's right. Well, you can take the boy out of America, but you can't take the American out of the boy, except when it's the accent.
That's right.
Meryl Streep couldn't even nail a good Australian accent. So
now we'll get down to business here. Firstly, for anyone who isn't familiar, what is the role of the eSafety Commissioner and what does that portfolio include?
Well, it's a unique role in the world. We're the first and only online safety regulator. We've had a 6-year journey. We were established in 2015. I think the story of how we were established is pretty interesting. Many of your listeners would know of Charlotte Dawson and the tragedy that she experienced. She was very open about depression and had a pretty public nervous breakdown, got some help, got back out on Twitter, and just the trolls were incredibly terrible. And of course, we know that that's what trolls do. They seek out weakness and then they seek to target that weakness. And, eventually, I'm sure there were a complex set of factors at play, but she tragically took her own life. And Alex Perry, the designer, was one of the first people to refer to it as the Twitter suicide. And lo and behold, I was interviewing for a role at Twitter to take on their public policy, their trust and safety, and their philanthropic work across Asia, Pacific, and Australia and New Zealand. And I said, hey, I'm not taking on this role unless I know that you're investing in safety. I was assured they were, and they did for the first year or so, but then it started to wane. And so I only spent about 2 years there at Twitter, and the things I saw really kind of shaped where I am here. But more importantly, that led to a petition to the government that said, hey, enough is enough. Government has to step in where online abuse is concerned. And what they decided to do, Malcolm Turnbull was the ICT minister at the time, and Paul Fletcher was the parliamentary secretary. So they decided to start small because, of course, regulating anything that resembles speech is something you have to tread upon lightly. So they formed the Children's eSafety Commissioner to start out with and set up the world's first and still only serious cyberbullying scheme. And I took the role on in 2017 and was asked to set up the revenge porn portal. And I said, yes, I'll do it, but I won't call it the revenge porn portal. Revenge for what? And this isn't porn that's meant for the prurient interest. Let's call it what it is, image-based abuse. Yep. And I do believe that the language we use is super, super important because if there's a lexicon that leads to victim blaming, then we're all in trouble. So this is a long way of explaining how we were set up. But what we do now is we try and help Australians have safer, more positive experiences online. And we approach that from 3 different vantage points. One, prevention through evidence-based research, but also insights from our investigative trends so that we can develop education awareness materials that are specially targeted for specific audiences. One size doesn't fit all here. And that's why co-design, which we'll talk a little bit about later, is so important. Then we've got the protection side of things, where we have a range of regulatory schemes where we have significant powers to take down seriously harmful content, but also to fine perpetrators and content hosts. So in addition to the youth-based cyberbullying and image-based abuse schemes I talked about, we have the online content scheme, in which we prioritize child sexual abuse material and pro-terrorist content. We've got new powers under the abhorrent violent material scheme that came about as a result of Christchurch. And with the new legislation, we'll have new powers around serious adult cyber abuse. We've already taken about 4,000 reports informally of serious adult cyber abuse. The threshold is really high. We can talk about how that works, but certainly those with intersectional or diverse backgrounds tend to be more targeted, and we'll be able to use that as a consideration in the context. And then finally, the third area that we focus in is what I call proactive and systemic change. We can try and prevent as much as we want, but things are still going to happen. People are going to continue to misuse technology. We have these protective services that no other country in the world affords its citizens in terms of taking down this seriously harmful content, but we need to change the threat surface for the future. And that means placing responsibility back on the platforms themselves through an initiative we call Safety by Design, which basically says, like the car manufacturers, you need to be embedding seatbelts, virtual seatbelts, and erecting digital guardrails to protect your users online. Don't wait till something goes wrong to retrofit a fix. Assess the risks. We know how platforms have been weaponized. Build the safety protections in. And that's a real cultural change program. But also we need to stay ahead of the different technologies and how they might be misused. So things like deepfakes and immersive technologies in the metaverse, how might those be misused to damage people in the future? Trying to get ahead of technology rather than catch up.
The scope of that sounds incredible. And it's, amazing that you're trying to tackle all of these things. One thing that you mentioned early on that I wanted to ask you about is you mentioned, your previous experience at Twitter. Could you explain a little bit more? So you didn't come from a government background. It sounds like you came from a tech background.
I came from 22 years in the technology sector, 17 years at Microsoft, 2 years at Twitter and a year at Adobe. But I, interestingly, right out of uni, in the early 1990s, I was full of big ideals and even bigger hair because it was the early 1990s. Went to DC and I worked for my hometown congressman from Seattle. And I was working on a range of social justice issues. And he came to me one day and said, we've got this small little technology company called Microsoft in our district. Can you work on telecom and technology companies, company issues as well? And so even before there was an internet, I started working at that intersection of public policy, safety, and technology. And that led me, I worked in the nonprofit sector, did my master's degree in international communications, spent some time in Europe, and then I was drafted by Microsoft to be one of their first lobbyists right before the antitrust case that the DOJ brought against them in 1996-97. But I had a really exciting experience there, being really on the ground floor of a burgeoning technology policy industry, which I think is now thriving. So I helped shape Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, for better or for worse. I think probably for worse now. I helped put on the first White House Summit on online safety under Clinton back in 1996. So I had a unique set of experiences, and I've always felt passionate, particularly about those who come from diverse backgrounds and how technology can be misused to silence their voices, to denigrate. So much of the abuse we see today on social media, of course, is caused by humans. And, we're never going to eradicate the prejudice and the racism and misogyny and homophobia that exist in the world. But what I think we can do is make sure when we see it, we call it out, we try and take it down when it reaches proper thresholds, because we don't want to normalize that behavior in the online world. We don't want our young people seeing that if you speak out, that you'll be hammered down for talking about who you are and who you love.
You're in this role here in Australia. It's a world first position. That's correct?
That's correct. The Fijians just last year established their online safety commissioner. The Irish are also forming an online safety commissioner. The UK is adding these online harms functions to their communications regulator, Ofcom. Canada is looking at our model, and we've just been talking to folks in the US that are advising the Biden administration on what next in terms of the future of technology.
Okay, so the U.S., you always have to wonder about the U.S. considering, Silicon Valley is there. So they haven't really set up an agency or a role parallel to this yet?
No, and that's been a real challenge for us because we are a unique agency and we blend a lot of roles from across a bunch of different agencies, but also NGOs. We do have we're kind of a hybrid government agency. There is an advocacy function that is certainly involved in evangelizing some of the work that we're doing around prevention, making clear there's a lot of course, cultural, societal, and institutional change that needs to happen. I'll be speaking at the National Women's Summit. And we know technology facilitated abuse, which is the misuse of technology that's almost ubiquitous in domestic and family violence situations. It's an extension of coercion and control that happens in those situations. And I do talk about my speech. I didn't want it to be totally heteronormative. That other people in less dominant relational roles also suffer from technology facilitated abuse. And for too long, when women, men, and others went to police and said, hey, not only do I have an AVO out against my former partner, I'm being harassed through technology, I'm being gaslit, they're following me, there's drones over my house, I found a surveillance device in the wall, in my pram, under my floorboards, which does happen fairly regularly. We still haven't gotten to the point where we recognize that is a form of abuse and it is a harm. And so we'll be talking about that. I'll also be talking about how gendered violence and targeted online harassment further entrenches inequalities that already exist in society, particularly when being online isn't an option anymore. Certainly in the age of COVID, the internet has become an essential service, but how many of us have roles where we need to be out online, whether you're a politician or a journalist or a small business owner? You need to be online to promote your wares. And if we're trying to promote voices without protecting them, then we're going to end up having people self-censor. And my view is that targeted online harassment is meant to demean, humiliate, and silence. And so we want to do more to help build people's psychological armor, give them the tools that they need to be able to manage that with blocking, reporting, and muting functions, but then to be there when things get really serious and are beyond any one person's ability to manage, particularly in things like with volumetric attacks or pylons.
Julie, we were talking before around there are different communities at risk, I suppose disproportionately than others. We're all at risk, I suppose, online. But about a year ago, eSafety released the Protecting Voices at Risk Online statement. What was included in that?
Right. Well, listen, I think it bears repeating that we know not only what we see in terms of our investigations and reports into our office, but from what research and anybody in the community can tell you. If you identify as LGBTQI+, if you are Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander person, if you have a visible disability, you're 3 times more likely than the general population to be targeted with some form of online hate. And sadly, in 2020, more than 1 in 6 Australians say that they experienced some form of online hate. And then if you layer on gender or fluid gender, and it goes without saying the terrible abuse we've seen directed towards the trans community, you layer different layers. For instance, you are a woman, you do identify as LGBTQI, you may be from a diverse ethnic background. You add those layers on, and then we see the prevalence and also the vitriol, the level of vitriol targeting those people is really off the charts. And I think that's another thing that we find ourselves reinforcing quite a bit, like the attitude, which I think is very Aussie, is, just get off the internet, why'd you send the email or the image in the first place? So a lot of victim blaming, just lose your phone, get a new email account. That's not always an option for people. And so we can either look at technology as a tool that provides a lifeline, or we can see it used and wielded as a weapon. So we want to be able to mitigate those risks to people and make sure that we're harnessing all the benefits of technology, but minimizing all the downsides. So the Pivaro statement was really, we'd gone on this journey, and a pretty quick journey, because we were a very small government agency. You think about an agency like Home Affairs, it's, hundreds and thousands of people. When I came into this office, there were 35 people, and we weren't trying to go to war with the internet. We were given a small scope. Within 3 months of being in the job, that the role was expanded from Children's eSafety Commissioner to eSafety Commissioner, looking after everyone. And of course, we weren't given more resources or any sort of expansion to be able to do that. So I had to get the basics done first. But last year I said, hey, we've got to really look critically and raise awareness that online abuse doesn't manifest itself across the population consistently. And not only is the prevalence much higher in diverse communities, but the way that the online harassment manifests is very different. It tends to be sexualized, violent, personalized, really, really awful stuff that, we should never be in that place where we think, well, we just need to toughen up, or this is a cost of being online or a cost of doing business.
Is that because of the perceived anonymity, the fact that you're not seeing another human being face to face, that, people, I guess, forget about the human element? Because it seems like people will say stuff online that they would never say to someone's face in real time.
Yeah. Well, that's known as the disinhibition effect. And I think that certainly does play a role when you're a cowardly keyboard warrior. We certainly see that in the context of even road rage. But we also know that there are hateful people out there. There are trolls out there that their sole purpose is to cause harm. We often talk about the dark tetrad. So, what are the kinds of, what motivates people to do this? Narcissism, masochism to a certain degree. It's sociopathic activity. But yeah, people say things that they wouldn't necessarily say online. That said, and anonymity is certainly a challenge in every form of online abuse that we investigate, particularly child sexual abuse material and pro-terrorist content. But if you look at sort of the racist and hateful tweets and Instagram posts that were directed towards the three players of African descent in the English Premier League, there was a company called Crisp in the UK that did an analysis on these posts. There were about 12,500 that were clearly racist and hateful that were out in the open, created by 10,000 different accounts. 99% of them were identifiable by their account, which basically says to you, some people don't give a damn if you know who they are. There's also some responsibility that I do think needs to be placed back on the platforms as well. So for instance, Facebook has a real names policy. We all see a lot of people hurling threats and hatred that are using either a pseudonym or imposter accounts created for the purposes of bullying or harassing people. I mean, we've even seen in youth-based cyberbullying cases, young kids setting up 60 different imposter accounts
60.
to target the same child. Yes. So every time we're playing that perennial game of whack-a-mole, and every time we have one taken down, another one pops up. So if you have a real determined predator, I mean, there are things, what we call signals, that the companies can see. They can uniquely see based on the tools, based on the activity or the behaviors of an account, or even a specific IP address, or on a specific device. But it's happening, they've got billions of users, and this is happening at scale. We need to sort of put more tools, more priorities, more of the technology solutions into detecting and removing this hateful content before it actually reaches the target and causes the damage. And so this is what we're pushing with Safety by Design.
Now I'm thinking Australia is a place, we've got 20 some million people. And as you've said, these platforms have, you're in the billions when it comes to the scale of, online communities. How willing are they to play ball with you when they're based in another country and, Australia isn't necessarily the biggest player in the game?
Yeah, no, I mean, that's a good question. When the legislation was being developed, I told you I was at Twitter. Interestingly, it was only Twitter and Yahoo that agreed to sign on to what is called the Tier 1 cyberbullying scheme, which basically said we will provide you 24/7 help if a child is being cyberbullied. At the 11th hour, Google, Instagram, Facebook decided they weren't going to sign up to that. And, my belief is because the US companies didn't want to start the precedent of saying, yes, we will work with a regulator on targeting online harms. But practically, when we raise issues, I mean, we're talking to the platforms every single day. And we've had to rely on them, particularly where adult cyber abuse is concerned, rely upon their goodwill. Of about the 4,000 informal reports we've received, we've escalated about 71 cases to them, and they have complied and taken the context down. See, I think what's really challenging when you have this kind of scale and scope, so Facebook, for instance, has 2.5 billion users. They have content moderation and content moderators that they totally outsource. And these people who are looking at this horrible content have about 30 seconds to a minute to decide whether a particular post or a tweet contravenes their policies. So they're not looking at the entire context of the tweet or post, for instance. And so often people and things fall through the cracks because they don't get it right. What we've decided to do, or the government's decided to do, is to set us up as a safety net so we can bridge that inherent power balance that exists between the tech behemoth and the everyday user, and we can advocate on their behalf. And that's precisely what we do. So even if we're not successful in getting content taken down, but we actually have, for instance, in the image-based abuse scheme, we're dealing with lots of rogue porn sites and sites that are set up for the purposes of humiliating people. We still have an 85% success rate in terms of getting the intimate images and videos taken down without consent. And they're, like I said, they're almost all domiciled overseas. So it does make a difference if you've got a government crest behind you. You can prove that they're violating their own terms of service. They need to be held to account. Otherwise, this won't happen.
Absolutely.
And yeah, we're looking forward to having really a network of online safety regulators so we can work, across the globe together to really target this at scale.
You mentioned, I think it was 4,000 kind of informal reports received to date, but you've also touched on, I guess, the scale of things when it comes to pro-terrorist issues of pro-terrorism online in digital spaces, or child abuse in online digital spaces. People listening who think, I'm the victim of abuse from my intimate partner, or, experiencing online family violence, I shouldn't be bothering the eSafety Commissioner's office. But are you dealing with those? Is that part of the 4,000? Is the informal reports around, everyday people as well?
Oh, it's all everyday people, really. Yeah, that's the predominantly we help everyday people. There are some, I suppose, visible pylons that might happen, or anyone we help, has to follow. To not enliven our powers, we need the evidence. It needs to be reported into us. So yeah, we are helping the everyday people, and we don't make judgments about. We're not saying that youth-based cyberbullying or image-based abuse or cyber stalking, one is less important than the other. They're all important. And we actually have different teams focused on each of those different areas. Now, the adult cyber abuse scheme has now been, with the passage of the act, we will now have a new scheme, and we're hiring a team of 8 investigators right now. And that scheme will be stood up in January 2022. So all of the teams work together because they're looking at pretty confronting content on a regular basis. They're in what we call the hotline room. We've set it up to provide surge support. So for instance, over last year, over COVID, around the Easter long weekend, we saw 600% spike in image-based abuse, the non-consensual sharing of intimate images and videos. One was because people were using digital intimacy tools more often, and things were being shared. But we also saw 4 different variants of sextortion scams. So we had people coming to us. When you have a 600% increase, we needed to pull people from other teams to sort of help us. I mean, part of what we try and do is provide compassionate citizen service with really wraparound support. So even when we can't take down the content, and like I said, we have a pretty good strike rate of doing so, certainly when it hits the threshold, there are other things that we can do in terms of working to address the conflict that might be fueling online hate. And that's what we see, for instance, with youth-based cyberbullying. It's almost all peer-to-peer and an extension of conflict happening within the school gates. So we'll often bring, with the victim's consent, of course, parents in and the school system in to target whatever the issue is happening on the school ground. And we find that once we take down the content and that's settled, that the online abuse ceases. So we provide people with wraparound mental health support. We've got a contractual relationship with the Kids Helpline, for instance, and we've referred about 12,000 young people to them so they can talk to counselors 24/7 on their own time, whether they want to do it by phone or via chat. So all of these things, I mean, this is really important. You should never minimize the impact that online abuse is having on you. I mean, we hear from, Indigenous people, they're experiencing casual racism every day. The targeted online abuse really just exacerbates all that, and it's designed to wear people down. And I'm sure you'd hear the same about homophobic or transphobic commentary.
Since you've come out with the Protecting Voices at Risk Online, which you had an acronym for before, what was it?
PROVARO.
There you go. I love that.
Voices at Risk Online. We find ourselves using lots of acronyms, so sorry about that. And I have to saying LGBTQI plus and getting the I and Q mixed up is something that I trip over all the time.
That's a live discussion for us in the community, so no apology necessary.
Well, I think, but what that says right there is that you've got tremendous amount of diversity in that community. And, earlier, Caleb, I was saying there is no one size fits all to online safety. We need to do age appropriate, but also community appropriate design of prevention materials, but also responses. And we have to recognize that there's even diversity within these communities. And that's why engaging with the communities themselves is so important.
Since that research and reporting has come out, what actions have you started to take along the way?
So the 2 people at eSafety leading this work are Paul Clark, and he's working with Ramon, and they have been sitting down with a number of organizations, trying to get a better and kind of in-person as well as community understanding of the kind of online hate the community is experiencing. We started with broader desktop research to kind of look at what's out there, no reason to reinvent the wheel. And then Paul and Ramon had a series of community workshops. So some of the workshops were held with Thorn Harbor, ACON, and the Pinnacle Foundation. But they know they worked really, really hard to make sure that there was a really solid representation of the diversity that exists within the community. So the trans community, again, those with kind of layered intersectional factors that may make things even more challenging, those from Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities, from the culturally and linguistically diverse communities, and those from the disability community. And then the next step was that our research team undertook some more in-depth interviews to get a greater detailed understanding of how the community are affected by online abuse. And these in-depth interviews, almost become like case studies as well, obviously, ones that we keep to develop content. But we wanted to have a deep, multifaceted understanding about not only what was happening and how it was manifesting, but how it was impacting people in the community. And the sad fact of the matter is every participant that we engaged with had experienced some form of cyber abuse. I talked about the normalization. It strikes me as really tragic that, a lot of people in the community have become used to homophobic abuse from outside the community. But we also really surfaced up some interesting, lateral violence challenges from within the community. I mean, that was surprising to me for someone that isn't ensconced in the community on a regular basis. But it's that internal abuse within the community that was said to be the most hurtful and harmful, and that's really understandable. So really the groups that are most at risk, are not only experiencing transphobic or homophobic abuse, but there are layers of racism and attitudes to bi women, people with a disability. And I think we see this really across the general population, but this also came out in terms of some of our engagements with the LGBTQI plus community, is that sometimes they felt that outright cyber abuse, that's easy to identify, but it's the low level kind of microaggressions and nastiness that kind of wear people down. And, that was described as harder to recognize and at times not really called out until a situation escalated. And I think about this as like death by 1,000 cuts, if you will. It's, it just wears people down emotionally and psychologically. And so we need to be able to look at the cumulative impact of that casual everyday racism and homophobia, but also think about how the long-term impacts and how we tackle that.
I like what you have touched on there as well around the lateral violence, because as you said, it may have surprised somebody who's not involved in the community, but I think for a lot of people that are very community connected, it's unsurprising because we do see lateral violence in face-to-face spaces, let alone the digital space. So I guess the education piece there that you're developing is, I guess I would wonder, is sure there's something there for people who to understand as victims where you go to from here, but I guess also maybe helping educate people that they may themselves be engaging in activity that would kind of make them perpetrators. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I think it's absolutely fair. And recognizing when you're perpetuating the hate too is a really important step on the journey and to kind of addressing this real societal scourge, I'd say. But what I'm really excited about is that we're continuing to work with the community, and we're co-creating resources that address these needs. Right now, we're working on 3 key modules. One is around the apps that are typically used in the community for online dating and hooking up. And again, there are conventions in the community that we need to make sure that we're addressing, and we try and do that with a bit of humor. as well, and in engaging the right kind of people in the development space, but also the right kind of spokespeople. So we're also talking a little bit, we have a module on respectful behavior online so that you can identify when you might be actually being the perpetrator rather than the recipient of the abuse. And then different really community-based approaches and strategies to developing and building resilience.
Yeah, that's a great point. And as you mentioned, I guess one of the considerations I think a lot of people in the LGBTIQ community would think about is that hooking up apps, it's a different sort of a racism that, people have kind of passively there, whether that's embedded in a profile on Grindr or, another kind of hookup app, so to speak. And I don't know if it's necessarily unique to the LGBTI communities, but it is certainly a discussion that we hear with a lot of frequency.
Oh, yeah, that was definitely something that stuck out to me, that it wasn't even subtle, what people would put in some of their Grindr profiles. Like, I'm not, if you're Black, I'm not interested. Or if you're Asian, I'm not interested. And I thought, wow.
Yeah, it's pretty unapologetic and pretty blatant. Yeah. And I think some people don't see that as a form of racism. So like you said, that's a piece of work that has to be done there around re-educating people.
Yes, we all have preferences, but we don't need to express them in an exclusionary way.
A lot of people who are listening to the show this week probably, as you said, unfortunately, the statistics kind of dictate that quite a few of them may have had online experiences themselves that are forms of online abuse. And I know there are so many different forms of online abuse that could be, via chat room spaces or on Facebook or on hookup apps. But is there any sort of overarching advice you would give to people if they themselves have found them in a position of being a victim of online abuse?
Yeah, well, first I would just direct people to eSafety.gov.au. We've got a range of existing resources to support all Australians in dealing with adult cyber abuse, and we have that in multiple languages. So even just, as the call to action, just not waiting for something bad to happen, but just thinking about what are some of the ways that people deal with this and what are the tools that are available. But, generally speaking, it depends on the tweet or the post. I mean, we generally say resist the urge to respond unless you're someone who's incredibly clever, like Benjamin Law, and you can work on effective counter messaging and put that person in their place. Make sure you save the evidence of it, particularly if it's repeated. Report and block at all times. The more you report someone's abusive, even if you're seeing somebody else being reported, the more that gives the platform signals that there is a particular account or user that's engaging in abuse. And we still have some work to do to ensure that the platforms are enforcing their own policies, and we'll have new powers to encourage that. But check out the tailored advice. Seek help. If it's really getting you down, don't be ashamed about that. It's designed to demean, humiliate, and cause emotional and psychological distress. We know particularly when your intimate images and videos have been shared online without your consent, that can follow you for a very long time because you don't know who's seen it, who hasn't. And so, give yourself a break, seek out mental health support and talk about it. So I guess those would be my top tips. But talk about the issue with your mates. Support your mates when you see it happening. Talk about the issues within the community. And again, we do currently have a scheme for removing intimate images and videos that have been shared without consent. We have an 85% success rate in doing so. So report to us. Again, you can go to eSafety.gov.au. January 23rd, 2022, if you're experiencing serious cyber abuse with the intent to harm, if it reaches that really high threshold, you can reach out to us and give us context. In most cases, our investigators will ask for as much information as possible so that we have the whole context of the situation. And we will be able to consider these intersectional factors if there's abuse targeting a specific Australian individual because they're part of a community, for instance.
You mentioned before about reporting and blocking. And is there a role to play for people who are, I guess, witnessing this? So if someone's seeing like a friend of theirs and in the comment feed, they're seeing someone else really hurl that abuse, would we encourage, kind of, I guess, third parties to report and block people as well? Does that help?
Absolutely. I mean, reporting, blocking, calling out when it's safe to do so. I think you've got to read kind of the intent and think about who the messenger is behind the post or the tweet. If it's a troll, for instance, that's just seeking to cause harm, you may end up escalating the situation. But it may just be someone who's saying something out of ignorance. And sometimes it is that upstander, that the person that's not directly in the frame, that can help shut that down or correct the record or make sure that that people aren't getting away with tweeting and posting things with total impunity. The other key is, use those muting functions. Sometimes you don't want the person on the other end knowing that they've gotten to you. And if you overtly block them, they'll know that, but you can mute them so that you don't see their harmful content, but they have no idea that you've tuned them out.
Yeah, that's a great point. Another one that I wanted to ask you about, and this is, I guess, something I've seen, at least amongst men who have sex with men on social networking sites, is that sometimes they'll, I guess, this sort of digital form of kiss and tell, but people will actually say, oh, I hooked up with such and such, and share kind of an intimate picture of that part of whoever they've hooked up with along the way. Where does that sit within legal land?
Well, depending on the context and what's in the picture, it could be considered image-based abuse. So if you go to that hookup or that person and say, hey, I'm not okay with this, I want you to take it down, and they don't, then they're sharing an intimate image without your consent. You can absolutely come to us. And as I said, we have a range of powers. We can take an educative approach through an informal or a formal notification. And then if we issue a removal notice and it isn't taken down, then we can take a range of remedial actions. We can actually even force people to apologize, to remove and delete images from, say, their iCloud account, and then we can ultimately fine them.
Yeah, because I think that's one of those things that people don't necessarily think about, because they may not be sharing it with sort of ill intent, so to speak, but it's really not their image to share without explicit consent from the party who provided it in the first place. Absolutely.
And if it's intimate, and so we've got a pretty broad definition of intimate images. This could also include deep fakes or depictions of a particular person. It even includes women from particular religions who aren't in their traditional dress.
Oh, right.
We've really tried to, with this chance to review the legislation, we've sort of seen where the weaknesses are, where, again, this is meant to send, be menacing, harassing, and offensive, and to cause harm. And it can manifest differently in different communities, whether it's a religious community or the LGBTQI plus community.
And speaking of LGBTIQ plus communities, you've been talking about a great piece of work that you've been doing through community consultation and development of resources. When can we expect to see those resources coming out?
Those will be coming out in the beginning of next year.
Fantastic. All right. Well, we can.
But in the meantime, I do hope some of the adult cyber abuse and the image-based abuse materials are there, and we have some specifically tailored to the community in the image-based abuse portal.
And again, we'll link to that on the show page, but that's esafety.gov.au. Julie, I want to thank you so much. And I guess if you had one piece of advice for anybody out there when it comes to things online, because I guess, like you said, it's come to that point now where it's kind of a way of life it would be lovely to think that we can just avoid digital spaces and avoid all these harms. But we're kind of beyond that point with the way that society has embedded it into how we operate. As people go into that space, you can kind of feel a little bit overwhelmed with that idea of online safety. Do you have an overarching piece of advice you ever give to people?
I mean, I think the call to action is just to educate yourself, and don't wait until it happens. Be prepared, know what your strategies are going to be, know what kind of psychological armor you want to build, and whether you want to respond or just to ignore. I guess also recognizing that this does cause real harm, and it can be really exhausting and exasperating after a period of time. So look after yourself. Make sure that you're talking to your partners and your mates and those in the community, and you're working together. You're being an upstander rather than a bystander when you see it. And please just know that there is help at eSafety.gov.au. If we can't help with a particular takedown request, we can refer you to other resources.
That's some great advice. Julie, thank you so much for joining us here on Well, Well, Well.
Thank you for having me.
Well, that has been another episode of Well, Well, Well here on Joy 94.9. A big thank you to my guest this week, Julie Inman-Grant, Australia's eSafety Commissioner. Now, if you missed any part of this episode or previous episodes of Well, 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 have no fear. Head to the Joy website, joy.org.au/well, where you can catch up, subscribe, and listen to previous episodes of Well, Well, Well. And we'll also have the show page where you can find links to the resources that we mentioned in this episode and previous episodes. Until then, look after yourself and those around you. You're listening to Well, Well, Well here on Joy 94.9.
This podcast was produced by Joy Media. You can support Joy's diverse sound and diverse community this June by donating to Joy Radiothon 2024. Go to joy.org.au/radiothon. And remember, we all flourish with joy.